What would you do if your mailbox didn't just hold bills, catalogs, and junk flyers, but threats? Imagine walking outside on a blistering Texas afternoon. The air heavy with the buzz of cicadas, your boots crunching against gravel, and reaching into that rusty metal box by the roadside. You expect the usual, maybe a credit card offer, maybe a bill. Instead, you pull out a thick stack of envelopes, each one stamped in bold red ink, "Final Notice." You tear the first one open, your hands already slick with sweat. A fine, $50. You open another, 100, then 200. By the 10th envelope, your stomach sinks. The fines aren't just adding up, they're multiplying, doubling, snowballing into something monstrous. By the time you've gone through the pile, the number is so staggering you almost laugh at it. $250,000. That was the nightmare facing Bryson Keaton, a 52-year-old entrepreneur who thought he had finally found peace. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't reckless. He had built his life on discipline, on grit. After decades of hustling in business, he wanted space. A few acres of land just north of Austin, in a town called Georgetown. A slice of quiet away from the chaos of city life. He imagined early mornings with coffee on his porch, watching the fog roll over the hills. He imagined evenings tinkering in his workshop, the sound of country music drifting out as he worked on old tools. He built a simple gravel driveway, put up a shed, installed a modest porch light that glowed amber against the Texas night. Nothing flashy, nothing offensive. But from the moment he moved in, something felt off. Across the way sat a neatly planned subdivision. Rows of manicured lawns, houses painted in soft beige and gray, mailboxes standing like soldiers at attention. It was the kind of place run by a Homeowners Association and HOA. Bryson's land, however, was outside those gates. He hadn't signed up for their rules. His deed was clear. Independent property, not bound by the HOA. At least that's what he thought. The letters started small, friendly reminders. They called them. A note about his gravel driveway, clashing with community standards. A complaint about his shed being unsightly. Even the direction his mailbox faced was apparently a problem. Bryson laughed them off at first. Clashing with community standards? He wasn't even part of their community. But the HOA didn't laugh. Every week, a new letter arrived. Each one more hostile, more demanding. The fines escalated, $50, $100, $500. Then thousands. Each letter carried the same cold signature, the same corporate arrogance. Final Notice. One evening, Bryson sat at his kitchen table. The letters spread out like a losing poker hand. The yellow light above hummed softly. Across from him sat his oldest friend, Mick Devereaux, a man with weathered hands and a stare sharp as barbed wire. Bryson slid another envelope across the table. $250,000, he muttered, his jaw tight. Mick picked it up, scanning the bold, underlined words. "They can't just fine you like this," he said, his voice gravelly. "Your property isn't even inside their gates." Bryson leaned back, frustration etched into his face. "Tell that to them. They act like they own me, like I'm trespassing on my own land." Mick tossed the letter down, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't about fines. It's about control. They want you to bend." Bryson's hand clenched around his coffee mug. Then they picked the wrong man. But Bryson underestimated just how far the HOA was willing to go. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. They turned neighborhood barbecues into whisper campaigns. Families who once waved at him now crossed the street. At the grocery store, conversations hushed when he walked past. They painted him as a lawbreaker, an outsider, the man who didn't respect the character of their community. The isolation stung worse than the fines. One night, as Bryson stood on his porch, he caught sight of shadows in the distance. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, their voices low, their eyes occasionally flicking toward his house. Rumors spread like wildfire. His land was messy, his shed dangerous, his lights too bright. Little things exaggerated into crimes. Bryson felt the weight of every glance, every whisper. They weren't just fighting him on paper. They were turning the entire community against him. The letters kept coming, relentless. His mailbox became a weapon. The stack of fines grew so thick it felt like a physical burden, a paper mountain he couldn't escape. Each envelope wasn't just a bill. It was a reminder that someone, somewhere, was trying to crush him. And that's when Bryson realized this wasn't going to stop. Not on its own. He had two choices: roll over and pay, or fight back. And Bryson Keaton wasn't built to roll over. But here's the twist no one saw coming. The HOA wasn't just picking a fight with a stubborn landowner. They were picking a fight with a man who had more than just grit. Buried deep in dusty paperwork, in old deeds and county records, was something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Something that would flip the entire war on its head. And when Bryson found it, it wouldn't just shake Georgetown. It would explode across the country. What exactly was in those records? And how could a single overlooked detail in a decades-old deed turn an entire million-dollar neighborhood into Bryson's battlefield? Stay tuned, because in the next segment the harassment escalates, the war intensifies, and the HOA shows just how far they're willing to go to break one man. Bryson thought the flood of letters was the worst of it. He thought the HOA would eventually tire of sending fines he refused to pay. But he was wrong. The letters were just the beginning, a warning shot. The real battle was only starting. It began with the visits. One morning, Bryson was in his workshop, sanding down a piece of cedar, when he heard tires crunching on his gravel driveway. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and stepped outside, squinting against the Texas sun. A black SUV idled at the edge of his property. 3 men in collared shirts and clipboards stepped out. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, like soldiers on patrol. "Mr. Keaton?" one of them called, already jotting notes. "Who's asking?" Bryson replied, his voice low and guarded. "HOA compliance officers," the man said, flashing a laminated badge as if he were law enforcement. "We're here to inspect violations." Bryson barked out a laugh. "Violations? You don't run this land. You've got no authority here." But they ignored him. The men walked along his fence line, scribbling notes, pointing at his shed, at his gravel, at the pile of scrap wood stacked neatly near his workshop. One of them snapped pictures with his phone. "Hey!" Bryson shouted, storming toward them. "You're trespassing. Get off my property." The man with the clipboard smirked. "We're documenting issues, community complaints. You'll be hearing from us again." Bryson's jaw clenched. He wanted to grab the clipboard, rip it in half, toss them back into their SUV. But he held himself back. He knew they wanted him angry, reckless. They wanted him to slip. Instead, he stood his ground, his voice steady but sharp. "Step 1 foot closer, and you'll be explaining yourselves to the sheriff." The men exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, they retreated, climbed into their SUV, and rolled away, dust swirling behind them. Bryson stood in the gravel, fists tight. He wasn't rattled easily, but something about their smugness, their quiet confidence, set his teeth on edge. It wasn't about rules. It was about dominance. And it didn't stop there. The next week, his electricity flickered. His water pressure dropped. Calls to the utility companies brought vague answers, endless transfers, and long holds. He suspected interference, though he couldn't prove it. But deep down, he knew the HOA had friends in the right places. Then came the neighbors. At first, it was subtle. Cars slowed as they passed his property, lingering just a little too long. Kids who once waved at him no longer looked his way. The friendly "Howdy, Bryson" he used to get at the diner turned into silence, or worse, cold stares. At the grocery store, a woman from the subdivision accidentally bumped her cart into him, muttering under her breath, "Troublemaker." At the hardware store, 2 men whispered loud enough for him to hear, "Should have followed the rules. He's bringing down the neighborhood." The isolation grew heavier with each day. It was as though a black cloud followed him wherever he went. Then came the incident that nearly broke him. Late one night, Bryson woke to the sound of his dog, Scout, barking furiously. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard. That's when he saw it. Spray paint across his shed. 4 words in jagged red letters. You don't belong. Bryson's chest tightened. He ran his hand across the dripping paint, the acrid smell stinging his nose. Rage boiled in his gut. Cowards, he growled. Scout barked again, his eyes fixed on the tree line. For a moment, Bryson thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping away into the night. But when he searched, there was nothing. The next morning, he filed a police report. The deputy listened politely, took notes, but his tone carried the weight of resignation. Look, Bryson, the deputy said, closing his notepad. I'll log it, but off the record you're making waves. Folks don't like waves. Bryson's eyes narrowed. So I'm supposed to just let 'em run me out? The deputy sighed. I'm saying pick your battles. That was the moment Bryson realized he was alone. The HOA had influence, money, connections. Even the law seemed hesitant to cross them. But Bryson wasn't about to fold. He spent nights at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of letters, deeds, and county maps. He pored over documents until his eyes blurred, looking for anything, any crack in their armor. Mick dropped by one evening, finding Bryson buried in paperwork. Still at it? Mick asked, leaning against the doorframe. Bryson didn't look up. They want me gone. They want me to bow. But I'll find something. Everyone slips up somewhere. Mick crossed the room, picking up one of the letters. 250,000, he muttered. It's insane. Bryson finally looked up, fire in his eyes. Insane doesn't mean impossible. They think they've cornered me. But I know one thing. What's that? Mick asked. Bryson leaned forward, his voice a low growl. Bullies always overplay their hand. As the weeks passed, the harassment escalated further. Anonymous calls at midnight, silence on the other end. Nails scattered in his driveway. His mailbox dented with a baseball bat. Each act designed to push him closer to breaking. But instead of breaking, Bryson grew sharper, harder, more focused. The HOA wanted him to feel powerless. But they didn't realize they were forging something else inside him. Resolve. And late one night, as he flipped through a stack of dusty records at the county clerk's office, Bryson's eyes landed on a detail so small, so easy to miss, that most people would have skimmed past it. But Bryson didn't skim. He read it twice, then a third time. His pulse quickened. He leaned back in the stiff wooden chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. The HOA thought they had him boxed in. But they'd made one critical mistake, one buried in the fine print of history. And Bryson was about to use it to flip the entire war upside down. What exactly did Bryson uncover in those dusty county records? And how could one overlooked clause in a decades-old deed give him the leverage to strike back at an entire HOA? Bryson sat in the dimly lit county clerk's office, the buzzing fluorescent light above him flickering every few seconds. In front of him lay the discovery that changed everything. A deed. Not just any deed, but the original plat of land records from the 1960s, long before the subdivision even existed. His finger traced the faded ink, following the legal jargon that most people would have ignored. But one sentence stood out like a spark in the dark. This property and all contiguous parcels described herein shall remain exempt from community oversight, neighborhood association governance, or any derivative entity thereof. Bryson's lips curled into a grin. The paper in his hands was more than old legal language. It was a shield, a weapon, a loophole that nullified every fine, every threat, every smear the HOA had thrown at him. They had no jurisdiction over his land. None. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For weeks he had been battered, isolated, and pushed to the brink. Now he finally had ammunition. And Bryson Keaton wasn't a man who sat quietly when he had ammunition. The next HOA meeting was held in their pristine clubhouse, a building Bryson had never set foot in. White walls, polished tile, framed motivational posters about community spirit. Outside, the parking lot overflowed with SUVs and sedans. Inside, men and women in business casual murmured over coffee, flipping through neatly stapled agendas. As Bryson pushed through the glass doors, the room fell silent. Heads turned. Conversations died. The man they had painted as a menace was standing in their sanctuary. He walked slowly, deliberately, boots clicking against the tile. He carried no folder, no clipboard, just a single sheet of paper, folded once and tucked in his hand. At the front of the room, Gerald Whitmore, the HOA president, a balding man with a permanent smirk, cleared his throat. "Mr. Keaton," Whitmore said, his voice oily but firm. "This is a private meeting. Homeowners only." Bryson stopped in the center of the room. His voice carried, low and steady. "Oh, I'm a homeowner. And I'm here because you keep forgetting one thing." He unfolded the paper with slow precision, holding it up. "You don't own me." The room buzzed with whispers. Whitmore raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Keaton, you've racked up hundreds of thousands in unpaid fines. You've been warned repeatedly." Bryson cut him off. "Warned by who? You? This little club you run? You think paper bullies me? Not anymore." He stepped forward, placing the deed on the table in front of Whitmore. "This is the original land plat, filed long before your association existed. See that clause? Read it carefully. My land is exempt. Your rules stop at my fence line." Whitmore glanced at the paper, his smirk faltering for the first time. A flush crept up his neck. That doesn't change the spirit of community standards," he stammered. Bryson leaned in, his voice dropping to a growl. "Spirit doesn't hold up in court. Paper does." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For the first time, Bryson saw cracks in their armor. Neighbors who looked uncertain, whispering behind their hands. The invincible HOA had just been challenged. Whitmore tried to recover. "You think this technicality protects you? We can litigate. We have lawyers." Bryson straightened, his shoulders broad, his eyes locked on Whitmore's. "Then bring him. But understand this. I don't scare. You vandalized my shed. You sent your little clipboard soldiers to my land. You turned neighbors into enemies. And I've had enough. You want war? You just got it." The room erupted, half in outrage, half in nervous murmurs. Bryson didn't wait for permission. He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the deed on the table like a loaded gun. That night, Bryson sat on his porch, a cigar glowing faintly between his fingers. Scout lay at his feet, tail thumping lazily against the wood. Mick joined him, handing over a cold beer. "Well," Mick said, chuckling. "Sounds like you dropped a bomb in their little clubhouse." Bryson smirked. "About time they knew I'm not playing defense anymore." "But you know they won't just roll over," Mick warned. "You humiliated them. Men like Whitmore don't take humiliation well." Bryson nodded, blowing out a stream of smoke. "Good. Let 'em come. Every time they push, I'll push harder." The retaliation came faster than he expected. Within a week, the HOA filed suit against him, claiming disruption of community order and defamation of governing authority. The paperwork was thick, designed to intimidate, but Bryson had anticipated it. He walked into the county courthouse, deed in hand, and filed his own countersuit. His claim: unlawful harassment, trespassing, and malicious conduct by the HOA. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the stack of evidence Bryson laid out. Photos of vandalism, records of anonymous calls, even utility irregularities he had documented. "You're really going after them, huh?" the clerk asked. Bryson's eyes burned with determination. "I don't go halfway." Word spread like wildfire. The HOA wasn't just fining Bryson anymore. They were in a full-scale legal war. Neighbors whispered about it at the diner, at the gas station, in line at the grocery store. Some cheered him quietly, admiring his grit. Others clucked their tongues, convinced he was bringing shame to the neighborhood. But Bryson didn't care about opinions. He cared about leverage. And now he had it. Late one evening, Mick showed up with a folder. "Got something you'll want to see," he said, handing it over. Inside were financial records, HOA dues, expenditures, payments to contractors. Bryson flipped through them, his brow furrowing. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "Let's just say, a friend of a friend," Mick replied with a sly grin. Bryson's eyes scanned the numbers. Well, what do we have here? Mismanagement, fraud, kickbacks. He closed the folder slowly, a fire igniting in his chest. "They wanted a war?" Bryson muttered. "Then I'll burn their whole kingdom down." In the weeks that followed, Bryson transformed from target to hunter. He filed motions. He subpoenaed records. He dug into the HOA's finances like a bloodhound. And every piece of dirt he uncovered gave him more power. But power attracts attention. And not just from the HOA. Late one night, as he walked scout along the edge of his property, a car idled at the far end of the road. His headlights off, engine purring quietly. Bryson slowed, his hand resting near the knife on his belt. The car didn't move, didn't leave. Scout growled low. Bryson stood still, his silhouette framed against the moonlight, and stared into the darkness. Finally, after a tense minute, the car eased away, disappearing into the night. Bryson exhaled, his jaw tight. The HOA wasn't just fighting him in boardrooms anymore. They were watching him, and Bryson knew what that meant. The war had escalated to a dangerous new level. With lawsuits flying, secrets surfacing, and cars lurking in the shadows, just how far would the HOA go to protect their empire, and how far was Bryson willing to go to bring them down? The courtroom battle was only the beginning. What came next felt less like a legal dispute and more like a siege. Within days of Bryson filing his countersuit, the HOA unleashed a wave of retaliation designed not to win on paper, but to break him in spirit. It started with whispers. At the diner, Bryson noticed conversations dying the moment he walked in. Where once he was greeted with nods or cautious smiles, now he was met with silence, with backs turned. Parents pulled their kids closer when he passed. Old friends gave stiff nods and hurried away. The HOA had spread the word. Bryson Keaton was a threat. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, printed on crisp white paper, stamped with the HOA's letterhead. They called him a danger to the peace and safety of our neighborhood, accusing him of reckless behavior, unlawful defiance, even patterns of intimidation. Neighbors he'd known for years started to avoid his eye. "They're poisoning the well," Mick muttered, slamming a flyer down on Bryson's porch table. "They're turning everyone against you." Bryson read the flyer slowly, his jaw tight. "This man's actions could lower your property value by 30%. "Property value," Bryson said with a bitter laugh. "That's their holy scripture." The harassment escalated. One morning, Bryson walked outside to find his mailbox torn from the ground, lying twisted in the ditch. Scout sniffed at it, whining. The next evening, as he returned from town, he saw it. Spray paint scrawled across his barn in jagged red letters. "Traitor." Bryson stood silently, fists clenched at his sides. The paint dripped, fresh. Whoever had done it was close. He turned, scanning the tree line, the shadows, the road. No one. Just silence. Mick arrived minutes later, his truck headlights cutting through the dark. He climbed out, eyes widening at the sight. "They're getting bold," Mick said. "They're getting desperate," Bryson replied, voice low. "Desperate men make mistakes." But the HOA wasn't relying on cowards with spray paint alone. They attacked from every angle. Utility crews accidentally cut his water line while working down the street. His trash service mysteriously stopped, leaving garbage piled at the edge of his drive. The county sent him letters about zoning violations that didn't exist. It was death by 1,000 cuts. And yet Bryson never flinched. He documented everything: photos, dates, times, witnesses. He kept a growing folder of evidence, thicker by the week, a testament to the war being waged against him. At night, sitting at his desk with a lamp casting long shadows across the walls, Bryson pored over HOA bylaws, county statutes, state property codes. His desk became a battlefield of paper, sticky notes, highlighted passages. "They want to drown me in red tape," Bryson muttered one night, slamming a statute book shut. "But I'll use their own rules to hang them with." The next HOA meeting turned into a spectacle. This time, Bryson didn't attend. Instead, he sent Mick, carrying a thick manila envelope. As the board droned on about landscaping approvals and noise complaints, Mick stood, cutting through the chatter. "This," he said, holding up the envelope, "is evidence of your corruption, misused funds, unauthorized expenditures, kickbacks to contractors, and it's going to court." The room erupted. Board members shouted. Whitmore pounded his gavel, face red, veins bulging in his neck. "This is slander," Whitmore barked. "No," Mick said calmly, placing the envelope on the table. "This is discovery." The whispers that followed were louder than any gavel. The spell of the HOA's untouchable image had been broken. But Whitmore was not a man to take humiliation lightly. That night, Bryson's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but instinct made him swipe. Silence. Then a low voice. "Back off, Keaton, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Bryson stared at the phone, the words echoing in his mind. He wasn't shaken. If anything, it steeled him further. But something about the voice felt wrong. It wasn't Whitmore. This was someone else. Someone outside the board. The HOA had allies. And those allies played dirtier than lawsuits and smear flyers. The next blow came harder. One morning, Bryson woke to pounding on his door. Sheriff's deputies stood on his porch, hands resting near their holsters. "Mr. Keaton," one of them said, "we've had a report of illegal firearms storage on your property. We need to take a look." Bryson narrowed his eyes. "You got a warrant?" The deputy hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet. But if you've got nothing to hide." Bryson cut him off, voice cold as steel. "Come back with paper. Until then, get off my land." The deputies exchanged glances, muttered something under their breath, and left. Bryson watched them go, teeth clenched. It was a scare tactic, a blatant abuse of influence. The HOA wasn't just smearing his name now, they were trying to set him up. That evening, Mick sat with him at the kitchen table, frustration etched on his face. "This isn't just about you anymore," Mick said. "They're weaponizing the whole system. Utilities, cops, neighbors. It's like they've got tentacles everywhere." Bryson nodded slowly. "Good. Then when I cut off the head, the whole beast dies." He tapped the folder of financial records, his eyes burning. "They want to bury me under their machine. But I'm gonna dismantle that machine, piece by piece." The car came back that night. Same spot, same engine idling in the dark. But this time, Bryson didn't just watch. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward it, each step deliberate, Scout trotting at his side. The car's headlights flicked on suddenly, blinding him. For a moment, he saw nothing but white light. Then the tires screeched, gravel spitting as it sped away into the night. Bryson stood there in the beam of his flashlight, chest heaving. Whoever they were watching him closely, too closely. And Bryson knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about property lines or fines. The HOA had declared war, and they had no intention of stopping until he was crushed. But what the HOA didn't know was that Bryson was about to uncover something far bigger than fines and harassment. Something buried deep in their own records that would expose not just corruption, but a secret powerful enough to destroy them from the inside. The night after the deputies came sniffing around his porch, Bryson didn't sleep. He sat in his office, the lamp's yellow glow spilling over the piles of files and ledgers he had dragged home from the courthouse. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Scout lay curled near the desk, ears twitching at every creak of the old house. Bryson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He was tired, bone-tired, but he refused to let fatigue win. He had fought battles before, out on the rigs, in the army, even in the chaos of trying to keep his marriage alive years back. But this fight, this was different. This wasn't about one man against another. It was one man against a machine. And machines only fell when you found their weak point. He picked up an old box he hadn't touched in years. Dust coated its lid. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, was a deed. His grandfather's deed. the document that had been passed down with the land itself. Bryson had never thought much of it. He always assumed a deed was just a deed, paperwork proving ownership. But something had been gnawing at him ever since the HOA's smear campaign began. He remembered the way Whitmore had looked at him during that first meeting, almost smug, almost as if he knew something Bryson didn't. He unfolded the yellowing paper carefully, the edges fragile in his hands. His eyes scanned the faded ink, tracing the elegant script. And then he froze. There, buried in a paragraph near the bottom, was a clause. This land, being unencumbered by any association or governance, shall remain sovereign property in perpetuity, answerable only to the county and state, exempt from communal ordinances. Bryson sat back, stunned. His heart pounded in his chest. Exempt from communal ordinances. His property, the farmhouse, the barn, every acre of soil, was legally immune to HOA authority. The realization hit him like a hammer. All those letters, all those threats, all those fines, they had no legal weight. The HOA had been bluffing from the start. Worse than that, they had knowingly crossed a line. "This changes everything," Bryson whispered. Scout lifted his head, as if he too sensed the shift in the air. Bryson grabbed a legal reference book from his desk, flipping through the pages until he found the section on property covenants. He compared it line by line with the clause in his deed. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhilaration. "This isn't just immunity," Bryson muttered, eyes widening. "This deed, it overrides them." The wording didn't just exclude him from HOA governance. It invalidated any attempt at enforcement on his land. The HOA had no legal standing, not with zoning, not with fines, not even with access. He laughed, a sound rough with months of pent-up anger. "They've been swinging at me with a paper sword." But then Bryson noticed something else. Attached to the back of the deed was an addendum, one he had never read closely before. His grandfather's signature was scrawled at the bottom, but above it the language was sharp and deliberate. In the event that any association should act in excess of its authority, the holder of this deed retains the right to petition for dissolution of said association's charter as pertains to this jurisdiction. Bryson blinked. Reread the line. Read it again. Not only was his land exempt, but if the HOA overstepped, he had legal grounds to petition the state to dissolve their charter. He wasn't just outside their grasp. He was holding a loaded gun to their entire existence. The next morning, Mick nearly dropped his coffee when Bryson showed him the document. "You're telling me," Mick said slowly, "that not only are you untouchable, but you can nuke the whole HOA?" Bryson nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Mick leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned. You've been sitting on a silver bullet this whole time." Bryson shook his head. "Not silver. Nuclear." But Bryson didn't rush to use it. No, he knew better. A weapon like this wasn't meant to be waved around recklessly. If he pulled the trigger too soon, they'd scramble, cover their tracks, maybe even try to rewrite history. He needed timing. He needed leverage. So he began quietly building a case, methodical as a carpenter laying a foundation. Every false fine, every harassing letter, every misuse of funds, every intimidation tactic. Piece by piece, he stacked the evidence into a fortress. Meanwhile, he played his cards close. At the next HOA meeting, he attended not to confront, but to observe. He sat in the back, silent, while Whitmore and the others carried on as though they were kings on thrones. Whitmore's eyes flicked to Bryson once, full of disdain. Bryson met the gaze without flinching. For the first time, Whitmore looked unsettled. That night, Bryson stood in his barn, running his hand across the fresh coat of paint where the word traitor had once been sprayed. His land felt different now. Not because the attacks had stopped, they hadn't, but because Bryson knew the truth. The HOA thought they were hunting him. In reality, he was luring them closer to the trap. "They've been fighting to break me," Bryson said softly, staring out across the moonlit fields. "But soon they'll realize, they've been digging their own grave." Scout barked once, sharp as if in agreement. But the HOA wasn't slowing down either. The very next week, Bryson received notice that they were seeking a court injunction to force access onto his property for inspection. Bryson smiled as he read it. For the first time since this began, he smiled without bitterness. "Go ahead," he said aloud, folding the paper neatly. "Try me." Because when that day came, he'd be ready, not just to defend himself, but to deliver a blow so devastating the HOA wouldn't recover. And in the quiet of his farmhouse, with the deed spread open on the table like a battle map, Bryson whispered to the night, "This land is mine, always has been, always will be, and now, it's my turn." The HOA thought they had cornered Bryson, but they were about to learn what happens when a man with nothing to lose discovers he's holding the power to burn their empire to the ground. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. At least, that's what Whitmore and his board told themselves as they filed into the community center, their polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. But Bryson knew better. He had been preparing for this night like a general readying for battle. The deed was tucked in a weathered leather folder beneath his arm, every clause highlighted, every loophole noted. His evidence, photographs, letters, financial records, was organized in binders that he had stacked neatly in the bed of his truck, parked just outside the building. When Bryson walked into the meeting, the room fell quiet. Not because of his size or his presence, though he carried both, but because something about him had changed. He no longer looked like a man under siege. He looked like a man who knew exactly how the war would end. Whitmore cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "Ah, Mr. Hale," he said with forced politeness. "I wasn't aware you planned to attend this evening. I trust you've come to discuss your continued non-compliance." A few neighbors snickered. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Bryson said nothing. He walked to the back of the room, placed the leather folder on a chair, and sat. His silence spoke louder than any insult he could have hurled. Whitmore shifted in his seat. He didn't like it, this calm, this control. Bryson had always been combative, defiant. Now he was waiting. For what? The meeting dragged on. Agenda items were ticked off, budgets reviewed, landscaping contracts approved. All the while, Bryson sat still, eyes locked on Whitmore. Finally, Whitmore couldn't stand it. "Mr. Hale," he snapped, "if you have something to say, I suggest you say it now before we move on." Bryson rose slowly, the leather folder in his hands. He walked to the front of the room, his boots thudding against the floor. When he reached the podium, he set the folder down and opened it with deliberate care. "I do have something to say," Bryson said, his voice steady, "and I'll keep it simple." He pulled out the deed, holding it up for the board to see. "This land, my land, is not under your jurisdiction. It never has been. And every letter, every fine, every so-called violation you've thrown at me? Legally worthless." Gasps rippled through the room. Whitmore's face went pale. "That's absurd," Whitmore stammered. "All properties in this development fall under the authority of this association." Bryson slid the deed across the table. "Read it. Out loud." Whitmore hesitated, eyes darting to the other board members. One of them picked up the paper, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the text. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock. "He's right," the board member whispered. The room erupted into murmurs. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to each other. Some looked relieved, others furious. For years, the HOA had ruled with iron fists and rubber stamps. To hear that one of their neighbors was free of that grip shook the foundation of everything they believed. Whitmore slammed his fist on the table. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that you've been a disruptive presence, Mr. Hale. The rules are for the good of the community." Bryson cut him off, his voice rising like thunder. "No, the rules are for control, and you've abused that control. Which brings me to this." He pulled out the addendum, sliding it next to the deed. "This clause gives me the right to petition for the dissolution of this association's charter if it acts in excess of its authority. And gentlemen, ladies, you've acted far beyond your authority. I've got evidence of harassment, misused funds, and unlawful enforcement attempts. If I take this to the county, the HOA doesn't just lose me. It loses everything. The room fell dead silent. Whitmore's face glistened with sweat. Mick, sitting near the back, couldn't help but grin. He'd seen Bryson take hits before, but never land one like this. "You don't want to push me anymore?" Bryson said, his tone calm but sharp as steel. "Because if you do, I'll burn this whole empire down. And when the dust settles, I'll still be standing on my land. The rest of you, you'll be answering to the state." For the first time, Whitmore had no reply. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Some neighbors rushed to Bryson, shaking his hand, thanking him for standing up to the tyranny they'd all quietly resented. Others avoided him, too afraid to be seen choosing sides. But Whitmore and the board, they scurried out like rats from a burning barn. Bryson walked outside into the cool night air. The stars above felt brighter somehow, the weight on his chest lighter. Scout wagged his tail from the truck bed, as if sensing the victory. But Bryson knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The HOA would regroup. They would panic, scramble, scheme. Men like Whitmore didn't give up their thrones easily. But for the first time in this war, Bryson wasn't on the defensive. He was holding the hammer, and he was ready to swing. The next day, the HOA's lawyer called Bryson directly. His tone was oily, falsely polite. "Mr. Hale," the lawyer began, "I understand there's been some confusion. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement. A compromise, if you will." Bryson chuckled. "You're not in a position to bargain. Surely we can find common ground." "There is no ground," Bryson snapped. "My land is mine. My rights are mine. And unless you want me to file this petition tomorrow morning, you'll leave me alone. Completely. Permanently." The lawyer sputtered, but Bryson hung up before he could finish. For the first time in months, Bryson felt free. But freedom didn't mean peace. Not yet, because he knew desperate men made desperate moves. And the HOA, stripped of its illusion of power, was about to get very desperate indeed. Standing on his porch that evening, Bryson looked out across the fields. The cicadas buzzed in the grass. The wind carried the faint smell of fresh hay. "This isn't just about me anymore," he murmured. "It's about every person they've ever bullied, every family they've ever bled dry. They thought they were untouchable. But now they're the ones backed into a corner." Scout barked, sharp and clear, as if punctuating the thought. Bryson allowed himself a rare smile. Time to watch them squirm. The HOA thought the fight was over. But when their desperation turned to reckless retaliation, the story didn't just stay in the neighborhood. It exploded onto the national stage. The board members of the HOA didn't sleep that night. Whitmore paced his study, phone glued to his ear as he called lawyers, allies, anyone who might offer a lifeline. But each call ended the same. Silence, hesitation, or thinly veiled excuses. Nobody wanted to be tied to a sinking ship. By dawn, Whitmore knew the truth he'd been avoiding. Bryson hadn't just embarrassed him. He'd cracked the foundation of the entire association. And word was spreading. It started with whispers at the local diner. Neighbors who'd sat silent for years suddenly found their courage. "You hear what Hale did?" One man muttered over his coffee. "Stood up to him. Took him down with their own papers." "My cousin's in another development," a woman chimed in. "They're talking about it there, too. Folks are saying if he can do it, so can we." By lunchtime, the whispers turned into a chorus. And by evening, someone had posted a shaky cell phone video of the meeting online. The clip showed Bryson at the podium, deed in hand, his voice steady as he declared, "This land, my land, is not under your jurisdiction. It never has been." The video went viral overnight. News outlets picked it up. Headlines blared across websites and TV screens. "Man defeats HOA with 100-year-old deed clause." "Local farmer exposes corruption in neighborhood association." The HOA showdown you have to see to believe. Comment sections filled with thousands of voices. Some praised him as a hero, a modern-day David standing up to Goliath. Others speculated wildly about the crooked ties between the HOA board and local developers. Memes appeared, painting Bryson as a cowboy outlaw riding against a bureaucratic empire. For Bryson, it was surreal. One morning, he opened his mailbox to find letters. Not from the HOA this time, but from strangers across the country. A handwritten note from Arizona read, "Mr. Hale, my wife and I have been bullied by our HOA for years. Watching you fight gave us hope. Thank you." Another, from Florida. "They threatened to foreclose on my parents for leaving their garage door open. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us." The pile of letters grew by the day. Bryson didn't ask for the attention. He didn't want fame. But the people needed a symbol, and whether he liked it or not, that symbol was him. Meanwhile, the HOA was imploding. Board members turned on each other. Some resigned quietly, not wanting their names dragged through the mud. Others lashed out, accusing Whitmore of overreaching, of leading them into disaster. And then came the lawsuits. Neighbors who'd been fined, threatened, or harassed over the years saw their chance. One by one, they contacted lawyers. A class action suit formed like a storm on the horizon. For the first time, Whitmore wasn't the predator, he was the prey. One evening, Mick came by with a six-pack of beer. He found Bryson sitting on the porch, watching Scout chase fireflies in the twilight. "Man," Mick said, setting the bottles down, "you're all over the news. Folks at the hardware store called you the HOA Terminator." Bryson chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't ask for any of this." "Doesn't matter," Mick said, cracking open a bottle. "Heroes never do. But look around. You gave people hope. That's bigger than any land dispute." Bryson sipped his beer, staring at the horizon. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who wanted to be left alone. But Mick was right, this was bigger now. The pressure cooker finally exploded at the next HOA meeting. The room was packed, not just with residents, but with reporters, cameras, even protesters carrying signs that read, "End HOA tyranny. Power to the homeowners. We stand with Hale." Whitmore walked in looking like a ghost. His tie was loose, his hair unkempt, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to call the meeting to order, but the crowd roared back. Angry shouts filled the room. "You stole from us. You harassed us. Step down." Whitmore pounded the gavel, but the sound was drowned in the chaos. For the first time, his authority meant nothing. And then Bryson stood up. He didn't have to say much, just a few words. "Your time's up." The room erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. And Whitmore, broken and humiliated, gathered his papers and fled the building. That night, the HOA officially dissolved. But the story didn't end there. News of the collapse spread nationwide. Talk shows debated it, politicians weighed in, even late-night comedians made jokes about HOAs picking fights with farmers. More importantly, ordinary people began digging into their own neighborhood contracts. Forums lit up with homeowners asking, "Could we do what Bryson Hale did?" In states across the country, petitions formed to reform or abolish abusive associations. Lawmakers took notice. Bills were drafted, committees called hearings. The movement had momentum, and it all traced back to one man, one deed, one stand. Bryson's phone rang constantly. Journalists wanted interviews. Advocacy groups wanted him as a spokesperson. Publishers wanted him to write a book. But Bryson turned them all down. He didn't want celebrity. He didn't want politics. He wanted peace. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed forever. Standing on his porch one quiet evening, Scout at his side, Bryson looked out at the fields glowing gold under the sunset. He thought about the letters piled on his kitchen table, the strangers who saw him as a hero. "This was never supposed to be about the world," he whispered. "It was about my land, my home." But deep down, he knew the truth. Sometimes a man doesn't choose the fight. Sometimes the fight chooses the man. And when it does, the world watches. Bryson Hale's battle wasn't just a story of one man versus one HOA. It became a symbol, a spark that lit a fire across the country. But for Bryson, the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence that finally returned to his home. The storm had passed. For the first time in years, Bryson's mailbox sat empty. No more folded letters with bold red ink. No more notices threatening fines or lawsuits. Just silence. And in that silence, he found something he'd nearly forgotten: peace. Scout lay on the porch, tail flicking lazily as cicadas hummed in the summer dusk. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke, and for Bryson, it was as if the land itself was finally breathing again. But while his home had returned to quiet, the world outside had not. Across the country, news anchors still repeated his name. Advocacy groups still called, begging for his support. Politicians whispered about the Bryson Hale effect, citing it in debates about property rights and community governance. Everywhere he turned, there were signs of the movement he'd never asked to lead. A farmer in Kansas had uncovered a deed clause nearly identical to his, freeing dozens of acres from HOA control. A retired teacher in Nevada had stood before her own board, refusing to back down, inspired by Bryson's story. Entire neighborhoods were holding town halls, demanding change. His battle had given birth to something much larger, a wave. One afternoon, Mick came by with a grin as wide as the horizon. "Did you hear?" Mick said, setting down a stack of newspapers. "You're on the front page again. They're calling you the man who broke the HOA. Bryson frowned, flipping through the headlines. He didn't feel like a man who had broken anything. He felt like a man who had defended what was his. "I never wanted all this," Bryson muttered. "I just wanted them off my land." Mick clapped him on the shoulder. "Yeah, well, sometimes you don't get to choose what your fight becomes. Sometimes it's bigger than you." Bryson didn't reply, but he knew Mick was right. The letters kept coming. Not threats this time, but thanks. From soldiers stationed overseas who owned homes back in HOA-run communities. From single mothers who'd been bullied into paying outrageous fees. From elderly couples who feared losing the homes they'd lived in for decades. One letter stuck with him most. It came from a boy, barely 12 years old, who wrote in clumsy handwriting. "My mom says we can't hang my basketball hoop in the driveway because the HOA doesn't like it. But I saw your video and she said you beat them. I hope one day I can play basketball in my own yard too. Thank you, Mr. Hale." Bryson folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about all the people who needed someone to stand up first to show it could be done. Still, not everyone saw him as a hero. Developers cursed his name in closed-door meetings. Lobbyists whispered in Washington, warning that men like him were dangerous. Some media outlets painted him as a stubborn holdout, a troublemaker who'd undermined community order. And Bryson wondered, was this really over? Or had he just lit a fuse that would burn long after his part was done? He thought about the HOA board, about Whitmore. The man had disappeared from public life, but men like him rarely stayed buried. Corruption didn't die, it hid, waiting. One night, as thunder rolled across the plains, Bryson sat alone at his kitchen table. The house creaked in the wind, Scout curled at his feet. He stared at the old deed spread out before him, the fragile paper that had changed everything. It struck him how thin the line had been between defeat and victory, how easily he could have given in, paid the fines, kept his head down. But he hadn't, and that decision had rippled outward, touching lives he would never meet. Bryson realized something then. He hadn't just defended his land. He had defended an idea, that a man's home, his sweat, his soil, should not be trampled by faceless committees and power-hungry officials. And maybe, just maybe, that idea was stronger than any HOA. The next morning, he woke to Scout barking at the edge of the yard. Bryson stepped outside, half expecting another letter, another knock on the door. But there was nothing, just the rising sun spilling gold across his fields. For the first time in years, the land was truly his again. He leaned on the porch rail, letting the light wash over him, and whispered, "It's over." But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered back, "Is it?" The story of Bryson Hale sparked a national conversation on HOAs and property rights. Across the U.S., homeowners continue to push back, inspired by his fight. But in a system built on money, power, and control, was this truly the end? Or just the beginning? Bryson Hale's war with the HOA may be over, but the battle across America is only beginning. What do you think? Are HOAs a necessary part of community life, or an abuse of power waiting to be challenged? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for your rights, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of ordinary people taking on extraordinary odds. Because sometimes, the fight chooses you.